Okay, great. So today we're going to talk about using JavaScript libraries with Domino Vault. This is one of my favorite topics after styling, after services, after workflow. No, they're all my favorite topics. Just a word up front. I'm not a developer by trade. In fact, I never wrote a line of JavaScript till I got introduced to this technology. But I'm hooked now, and I love integrating JavaScript libraries, mainly because there's so much functionality that's out there on the web and other sources. I mean, if you haven't figured it out by now, Domino Vault is kind of your classic single page web application. You open up the app with a URL and everything loads in your browser. It's a web page, you know, with JavaScript, HTML, CSS, like on any other web application. So that means that it's extensible, and this is where you can extend it with JavaScript libraries. So things that we're going to cover today, I'm just going to review again, and I know you've heard this, secureJS equals false. There are some JavaScript libraries, some JavaScript that you could probably bring in where you don't need this, but I think, you know, it's probably best to set it to false, because most of the libraries are going to do some things that go beyond the limitations of the sandbox. And then we'll get into, in a stepwise fashion, how you can add JavaScript to your app, how you can call libraries, multiple libraries, how you can use API keys with libraries. And I have many examples, and there's a URL in the references part of this deck, which will point you to where you can get these examples, and then we'll get into Q&A. So secureJS equals false. And again, I really don't like the name secure, because the idea here is basically what you're doing is turning off the sandbox and allowing full JavaScript versus limited JavaScript. And the way I like to differentiate on this is, do you know your developers and trust them? Well, then turn the sandbox off. If you don't know your developers, that means you really can't trust them. Keep the sandbox on. Right? So in most scenarios where it's you know, a handful of people building apps and you know who they are, turn it off. So the way that you turn it, Vault config.nsf, you can see the path there. And what you want to do is use the Notes client to open up that file. And to do so, you're going to want to use the ID that's attached to your person document in your Domino Vault instance. Right? So if you're using you know, Notes for mail here in the organization, but you know, you've got a different Domino Vault instance, you need the ID for the Domino Vault instance to get to it. So make sure you do that. Then you should be able to open it up. And once you find this, the path, and it's under local notes data, Vault names.nsf, then you should be able to open it up and configure it. All right. So adding JavaScript to your app, it can be real easy. It can be as easy as in the settings part of your app, just simply add a reference to the JavaScript file. And that file could be sitting out on a CDN. You could attach the JavaScript file. You could copy the JavaScript from the file and paste it into the onStart. They all work the same. Right, so let's go look at some examples here. So here's an example with just simple HTML. So you can see I've got 3 different paragraphs, and note the ID. So it's test 1, test 2, and then test 3 over here. And then I've got button 2 and button 3. All right. And I took this from W3 Schools on using jQuery. So it's just kind of a simple hello world jQuery example. Now on this HTML fragment on the onShow, I've got some jQuery commands, right? If jQuery is not present, these will not work and you'll get an error. So in this case, I come over to settings, files, and I can see here jQuery is loaded, or I'm telling it to load it. And I'm using a URL which is pointing to a CDN. In many cases, what I do is I just look for the JavaScript library on a CDN, and you'll find them out there. And if you use a CDN, that it will give you a way to use it anywhere in the world, and it's pretty quick. You don't have to worry about the overhead of a file in your app. So that works fine. You know, and if I do the same with the file attached, you know, that will also work. I didn't actually demonstrate the functionality. So here's the functions, simply just, you know, changing some things. Oh, isn't that nice? It's going to encrypt my hard drive right now. So that works fine. And then, you know, if I take all this and put it into the application on start, go over to events. This is that jQuery minified document. And of course, it's very, very wide, but that's the, you know, the base jQuery, and this all works. So just, you know, again, looking at the JavaScript that's here, or the jQuery that's here, it's saying, you know, on show, populate this ID test1 with hello world, and then if this button is clicked, change that to hello world with bold, and then change this value to Donald Duck. So the point here is that, you know, paste it into the application on start, attach the file, or reference it via URL. You can bring JavaScript into your application very easily. Now, if everything was that simple, that would be great, but of course it's not. Let's go back to the chart that we're on. All right. What happens if I have an API key? You know, if I put in a parameter here, you know, question mark and then API key into the file name, that's not going to work. The add file dialog is going to bark at that and tell you can't do that. Well, how do you deal with this? And you'll find that there are many examples out there where you need parameters on your URLs. I mean, Google Maps is one we'll take a look at. TinyMCE is another one we'll take a look at. And in some cases, I find that just simply attaching or referencing the file doesn't work. So there are some other techniques and some tricks that we're going to get into. All right. So now let me introduce a function which is going to be real important. And the command that we're going to use here is require. It's actually not a vanilla JavaScript command. It's a Dojo command. And because the Dojo library there is present with Volt, we can use it. And it's using for loading libraries. All right. So the technique here is that we're declaring a variable, which is our URL to the library. And then we're saying require, and we're using the URL as an input to this function. And then inside the function is the JavaScript code that we need to execute, which depends on the JavaScript library. All right? So it's a fairly simple concept. And here's, you know, that concept kind of built out in a little bit more detail. And we're going to take a look at this. So in this case, I'm establishing a variable, a URL, and it's cloud.tinymce.com. And you see I've got an API key there. And then I'm using the require function, and I'm saying let's require that URL. And then I've got inside the curly brackets the code for TinyMCE. All right, so it initializes TinyMCE. I give it some parameters around the mode, the editor that I want, the selector there, which is the the div. So that's the HTML div ID on my canvas, and then I've got some plugins that I'm loading, and this goes on. But it's fairly simple to bring this in and make it pop up in an application. So let's go take a look at TinyMCE. Here we are. So we'll look at this in edit. So here I've got my my HTML. So the class is editable div, all right? And then I've just got a width and an ID, all right? And then if we go over to events, on the form on load, I've got my code here. So there's my URL, all right? You can see the URL with the question mark and the API key parameter. And then I've got the require function. And then I'm initializing TinyMCE, all right? And then what I'm doing is I'm setting content in a rich text field, right? And this code will actually handle two different instances of TinyMCE. So you've got editor 1, editor 2, case editor 1, case editor 2. So if you wanted to put this in two different spots or multiple spots in your application, you could do that. But the basic idea here is I'm bringing in the editor. It surfaces in this HTML fragment. The markup that this editor, this rich text editor generates, goes into this multi-line field. And then when this multi-line field changes, there's an event here that says just set the content for this HTML area to whatever the content is in that multi-line field. So it's generating content, gets pushed in, markup, it gets pushed into there, then I push that markup into this fragment, right? And how does it work? There's my editor. So I can start typing. And I can go over here and say, let's take that and make that a heading 2. Go over here. So you can see the markup and how that's getting pushed into there. And you can put in images. You got to reference them via URL. You know, so if I wanted to actually grab this image, I probably could. There it is. That's quite big. Let's change the width of that. Make that to 50. Well, that's kind of small, but anyway, you get the idea. So you can see that what I have is the ability for building an application where the user can put in rich text, and then I could store that rich text as markup and render it in a fragment. There will be, instances in you'll encounter with users, with customers where this functionality is important. It's not native in the product. This is an extension that you can add. Right, so that's TinyMCE. Right, and this is, again, a summary of it. So it's a free editor. Anybody can use it. It's open source. You have to register to get an API key to use it. And you've got the URL there to use. All right, and you're fairly simple to implement. Let's take a look at another example. So in this case, I'm going to use the require function with a signature pad library. And the signature pad library is called signature_pad.js. And I've got a link to it here. It's out on GitHub. You can find out all kinds of information about it here. All right. And again, one of the things I love about JavaScript libraries, you think about it, it's probably out there someplace. You can probably find the functionality to bring in. The challenge then becomes, how do you bring it in and make it work, which can be a little bit tricky. In some cases, it can be quite simple. So back to the code that essentially calls this in. So the same technique again. So it's what is the URL, and I'm going to require that URL, and then I've got a function here to render the signature. All right, and this goes on. This is just kind of an abbreviation of the code, but it illustrates the basic technique, right, of the require function. So if we take a look at this application, so this is signature pad. This time what I'm going to do is I'm going to run this first. So I've set this up to accommodate two different signatures. And you can see the signature pad is rendering right here, so you can scribble whatever you want in there. And it's set to signature one, so I'm going to save this. It saves the image. So I've got it set so it's saving the image in PNG base 64 format. And it's setting it into this multi-line field. And then I'm rendering it. So that's the same thing I did with TinyMCE. Get the markup and then render it. All right, I could clear that. Do it again. Come over to signature 2. Save over there. All right. So it's useful functionality. If this is you need something to design, it's fairly easy to implement. Let's take a look at how it's done. So this is my HTML, and the key here is the ID in the class. Right, so that ties the JS to the HTML. And then I've got a couple of buttons here, ID, save, and clear. And the rest of this is just all styling. All right, we'll go over to events. And where is it? So I put it on, and you can do this in different locations. So in some cases, I'll do it on application on start, on form, load. In this case, I'm doing it on the HTML fragment on show. Same technique. So this is the URL. And then you can see that it's requiring it and setting all of the options for the canvas. And I'm going to save whenever I click a button to this multi-line field, and it's going to be based on which signature that I'm picking. All right. So that's pretty much it. And then on the on change, you'll notice one of the things that happens here is if I clear something, that clears. So that's all in the code there. All right. So let's move on and hope I don't get pinged on Teams anymore to the next piece of this. So far we've been loading one URL. Well, what if I have multiple URLs I need to load? Well, the answer is nest the functions. So you can nest these as deep as you want. And what you need to be mindful of is, in some cases, certain JavaScript libraries are going to be dependent on other JavaScript libraries. So you have to look at the order. And in many cases, it's very important the order that you're loading these things. All right, so you can nest these. So that's require. Now we're kind of getting into this topic of multiple libraries. And I'm going to introduce another technique that works. And this technique is some JavaScript that essentially just gets the URL and adds it to the head section of the document. Early on I mentioned that these are just web applications, and if you ever look at the the index.html or whatever the main page is for web application, you're always going to see a head section, and that's where you would declare whatever libraries and CSS that you want, right? This is a JavaScript way of taking a URL and putting it there. So if you went and you Googled JavaScript for adding a URL to a head section, you would get this code, right? So it's very standard code. And what I've done is I've wrapped it in a global. So you see the app get shared.loadScript. So I've got a global function called loadScript, right? So I have that on the application on start. And then when I want to call the function, you see the black code, the black box down below. I'm going to give it the URL. So that's the input parameter for the function. And I'm going to say load the script. All right, so that would then pass it the URL for jQuery and then load it. All right. The same technique, essentially also works with CSS. So if you change a few things, instead of attaching or associating a JavaScript file to the head section, what you can do is associate the CSS file. So, this gives you, kind of the tools that you need to load multiple JS files and CSS files to the head section of your application and then use them, right? And we're going to take a look at an example. So in this case, I built a sample little app, and it's using JQplot. And JQplot uses jQuery. It's built off of jQuery. So I add jQuery, and then I add JQplot. And then there are different options for JQplot. So based on the types of charts and graphs that you want to create, you're going to add other JavaScript. So in this case, I want bar charts. So I got to add JQplot bar renderer. So you can see that up there, that's URL 3. And then I've got another one here, which is an option. So the axis renderer. And then, of course, there's a style sheet that's associated with all this. So I have 5 different things that I'm loading. So, this is combining this technique, the app-get-shared-load-script function, which we talked about, and nesting. So you can see how I've nested the 5 different URLs. And if you look, the first 4 are load script. The 5th is load style. Now, I imagine with the CSS, it doesn't matter what order I load. That could be first, could be last, could be in the middle. But it's very important the order that I load these JavaScript libraries, because there's a dependency that they have upon each other. All right. So those functions load the libraries, and oops, let's go back. And then I've got some jQuery here that says when it's ready, go ahead and do the graph. All right, so we'll take a look at it. So we'll take a look at the app first. So if I change something, you see the values will change. All right. I could change the axis too if I wanted to. So if I wanted this to be A, B, C, so everything is dynamic. D, that's changed. Change that to 17. All right, so cool functionality, and you can hover over this, and it's going to tell you some information about the different bars. So how do we do that? All right, so here's the app. You can see I've got just a single line, and then these are number items. All right, here is the code that we showed in the PowerPoint presentation. So I've got the 5 different URLs, the 5th being the CSS. So I load the first 4, and then load the style sheet. And then here's the rendering of JQplot. And you can see how, because this is JavaScript, I can go grab the items in the form. So I just built in to my data values here, the values that are in the form. All right, so the BOF underscore single line, you know, et cetera, these numbers here, and then it renders it. All right, now, what I've also done is I've repeated that code, you know, the rendering code in each one of the values in the access label in the onChange event. All right, so every time one of these changes, it's executing that rendering code again. But just before rendering it, what I'm doing is I'm removing the previous chart, so I don't get a chart on top of the chart. All right, so yeah, again, you can see how it works. So that's adding chart functionality, JQ plot. All right, let's move on. All right. So far, everything's been logical. At times when I'm doing JavaScript library integration, sometimes I wonder if it's part art as well as science. I mean, here I've got a scenario where I have to use the require method in addition to the others. And I haven't tried this with the 4 URLs nested with require. But if I tried the 4 nested with the apt-get shared load script, it doesn't seem to work for whatever reason. this last piece here, when I add require, it does work. So I'll confess I don't understand everything of my code, but if it works, I'm happy. So let's go over to the application. So this builds off of what you saw with the signature pad. All right, so let's go find it. Here it is. It's called using PDF make.js and signature pad.js to generate and sign a PDF with nominal volt. I suppose what I'll do is I'll run this first. So come in here, fill out the form. I want to borrow $10,000 or 100,000, whatever it is, and I'm going to sign this. All right, I save this. It gives it a date. And now I can generate the PDF. The PDF is saved locally. You can save it wherever you want. And here it is. All right. So that's using 2 different JavaScript libraries. Let's take a look at how it's done. Here you can see the 4 different URLs. The first 3 I'm loading with the load script function, which is in the application on start. And then the 4th I'm using require. And this then, you know, once I get everything loaded, I'm rendering the signature. I've got my save and clear button. So we saw this before with the signature pad, right? And then I've got in the application, I'll show this from the form, a button here. And this button has all the code to generate the PDF. So what it's doing is defining the document. All right, so this is JSON data to define the document. And then it's going to, at the very end here, create the document. All right, so this is a PDF make command, and it's taking that doc definition, and I've got it to download, and this is the name of the file it's going to give it. So this doc definition here is the complete layout for the PDF. All right, so how do you get into this doc definition? So I've got the link here. You can go over to PDF.org. Let's go to screen show so I can click that, or pdfmake.org, and there's a real cool, let's get rid of that. There's a real cool playground where you can take a look at examples of using PDF Make. So there's basic, So you can see the doc definition here. This is what I built with that generate PDF button. So you've got all kinds of control over what you want to create. You can create tables, you can do lists, margins, images. All right, so it's a full declarative layout language for building PDFs. All right, so you could probably spend multiple days just learning about this, another course. But not to get too deep into that. The point is that I'm bringing in that functionality, and I'm doing some pretty cool stuff in Domino Vault with it, and it combines a couple of different JavaScript libraries. All right, so let's move on. This is such fun stuff. Yeah, so this again, this gets into, sometimes it's a little bit of art plus science. I found in some cases I'll use require, I'll use the app load script sort of approach that I showed you. But in some cases, I find that what you need to do is just give it a little bit more time to load. And I run into this when I have a callback on a URL, and Google does this quite a bit. So this next scenario is a Google Translate scenario. And if you were to look at just an HTML file with this in the head section, they would have the URL with the callback, and then some JavaScript to execute that callback. What I did was I took just the JS, I'm requiring that, and then I nested the Google code in a time function. All right, and the way a time function works is you essentially tell it how many milliseconds you want to wait before you call that code. So in this case, I put in 500. 500 equals a half a second, so it's barely noticeable that there's a pause there. But it was enough for it to work. In some cases, you may just benefit from the fact that the code doesn't need to be executed till you click a button or something. So you've got plenty of time for the code to be loaded. But in this case, I want the Google Translate elements to appear with the form. All right. So the idea is that they show up with the form, and it's going to translate the form into what language you last translated it into. And what's cool about Google Translate is it just kind of introspects all your HTML and just swaps out all of your strings with the language that you want. So let's take a look at this app. I'll close a few things down here first. That's enough. All right, Google Translate, here we are. So I'll launch it. So you can see I last had it in Italian when I took that screenshot. Let's put it in English. So now it's in English. And the nature of this form is to illustrate that it works on everything. So I've got a survey widget, a date, an attachment, some text, tab folder. It grabs everything. So if I want to change that to Vietnamese, it'll do it in Vietnamese. Got to click on it. There we go. If I want to change that to German, change it to German. All right. So it works real well. It's free. You don't need an API key for it. All right, so let's see how this works. So there's my div tag, and it's just an ID, the element. And this is the JavaScript code that makes it work. So there's the URL. And then I've got in a require function, a timeout function, which then renders that item, makes it part of the document object model. And these are the two lines of code that essentially do that. right? Everything else is just a wrapper, a time wrapper around that and loading a library. So that works real well. So something that you can steal and benefit from and implement into your applications if you want to. All right, let's move on. What kind of using JavaScript library session would be complete without talking about Google Maps and reCAPTCHAs? Let's take a look at Google Maps. And again, I've got the URLs here to go off and learn. Google Maps and reCAPTCHA require that you register, you get an API key. The examples that I have out on the forum, which I'm get to the reference material chart in this deck to point you to, those are without an API key. So they're not going to work, as they should till you put in the API key, and it's going to be real obvious where you put that in. So I'll run this one. So I've got it set to pick up whatever the latitude and longitude are in these fields, and I decided, well, let's just put in London. My last presentation was to folks in the UK, so I just decided to put in those two latitudes, that latitude and longitude. If I click, the way this works, if I click on something in the map, it's going to tell me the lat and longitude for that and the address. All right, so it's picking that up and it's passing it into Domino fields. Now, there's another function that I put into this, which is geolocation. So the button, where am I? It's determining my latitude and longitude. So I'm here in the North Shore of Massachusetts. All right, so I picked that up. All right, so we'll see how that works. So this is the HTML fragment for the div tag which displays this. Right, and then we'll go over to events. And most of this code I was able to copy directly from Google examples and paste in here. And you can see this code, Google actually used this technique, which I used in one of my functions. They hard-coded the URL directly into it. But this is the JavaScript way of adding a JavaScript URL to the head section of your app. And in this case, you can see where I put the key. So it's a parameter on the URL. And then I've got a function here to initialize the map. So this is just picking up the settings. What it's doing is it's getting the latitude and the longitude. All right, and I'm setting the zoom factor, the type of map that I want, satellite, road map, terrain map. And then I've got a listener. Right, wherever I place the marker, it's then going to pick up that latitude and longitude and redraw this. Right. Then in the form, on this button, where am I? The on-click button. I'm using a Volt function. This is a Volt JavaScript function called app-get-location. Right, and I actually saved the page in the documentation. So if you look in the Volt documentation under UI, app get location. So this is essentially the code that I used here. And all I'm doing is I'm getting a location and I'm putting it into the latitude and longitude fields. Right, and I've got it so that when those fields change, the map redraws. Right. Now, you could use the native JavaScript functions to do this too. So there's a navigator function which will do the same thing. But if you want to use the ones that are part of the product, you can do that. So not too difficult to figure out how all this works. But now you've got this ability to let people select locations on maps and figure out where they are, do geolocation. You can do for apps that are targeted for mobile, for laptops, you name it. All right, so let's go to the charts again. The next example we'll talk about is reCAPTCHA. All right, so this is the one where you've got to click the reCAPTCHA before you're able to put items into the fields, and in some cases it makes you pick out pictures in a puzzle. You never know when it's going to do that. Some cases it doesn't. So let's take a look at that app. Launch it first. So I am not a robot. Okay, we believe you. Now the fields are editable. Right. Now I'm going to let that sit there because it's going to time out and it's going to lock up again. And I want to show you that. Meanwhile, we'll come over here and we'll take a look at the code. All right. So there's the fragment for displaying the reCAPTCHA. And the code is right here, and it's in the onNew event, the form onNew. So I'm using the load script, so the app-get shared data load script function that I showed you before. So in this case, I've got a callback on the URL and some other parameters. And what I've done is I've used this technique of using require, so a require function, and I've nested that in a timeout function, so my time function. All right. And the way this works is that as part of the input for rendering the reCAPTCHA, there is a parameter called site key. So you have to have a site key. This is my site key. And there's a callback here. So when you successfully solve the reCAPTCHA, what it does is it puts a token. In this case, I'm putting the token into bo.f paragraph text 1. And that token expires. You'll see that this one is, yeah, so that's expired. So when it's expired, it's going to tell you that you're going to do it again. All right. And I've got some trickery going on here to lock and unlock the fields. So let's go over to the form. And what I'm going to do is in stages, let's unhide this token field. So this is the multi-line that I'm dumping the token into. And we'll do this again. So if I click this, you can see it throws the token in there. When the token expires, this goes away, so it's empty. So I've got it so the code looks to see that if this is empty, lock everything up. If it's not empty, then allow people to enter information. Right. So that's the reCAPTCHA app. All right. Back to the charts. There are some cautions here. You'll find that some things won't work. In some cases, I find that certain library versions won't work. I did some playing around with moment.js recently and found that the most recent versions don't work, but if you go to version 2.1, it does work. I've been playing around with AG Grid and have not been able to get that to work yet. So not everything will work. Am I still sharing here?
Yeah, you're good.
All right. Not sure why GoToMeeting popped up like that. I suspect that in some cases there are collision issues between the dojo that's present in Domino Vault and some of these external libraries. So, I can't make the statement that you can add any functionality you want. In some cases it'll work, in some cases it won't. the way to find out is just to go simply try and experiment a bit. And I've done a little bit of the legwork here for you with these examples, and hopefully we can all get smarter with our collective wisdom. All right. As long as I mention moment.js, we'll take a look at this. If you're not familiar with it, it's a library that's out there that makes it really easy to deal with dates. To format them, to do calculations on dates, to find dates in different geos, times in different geos. So let's go over to Volt, and we'll take a look at the moment scenario that we have. When in doubt, search. All right, there it is. So the way this works is library is loaded, and when you do this command moment, in the brackets, it's just simply going to give you a number, and that's this moment in time when I brought up this page. So then I use that as a reference point, and I could say, okay, based on that time and this date, let's add 4 days, let's add 2 months, let's add 3 years, right? So if you've gone down the path of doing calculations with time and dates, it gets complicated because it's all math underneath. And you've got to decompose a lot of these items and get quite detailed with the math, but moment makes it very easy to do. So loading this is using this require technique again. So here's the library, the version of the library, and all the code here in the function is code that you use to then set up and make the application work, the moment aspects of the application. All right, so lots of good stuff that's out there. There is a document in the support forum where I've published all these examples. Some are without API keys. So you've got a URL in this deck to show you where to get those free API keys to make those work. Hopefully that helps and makes you more productive.